NASA says now's the time to focus on Venus after the recent news about possible life there. But if you look back at NASA's old papers from the 60s, they used to call Venus a planet from hell. At the same time, Mars was the planet everyone wanted to explore. This naming of the planets close to the Sun wasn't random. During the big space race, the Soviet Union put a lot of effort into sending missions to Venus. The sad thing was, the planet didn't look like it could support life. But the Soviet space program kept at it until the Soviet Union fell apart. Thanks to Neil deGrasse Tyson, now we know why. Let's look at those old pictures from Venus that the Soviets kept secret. The end of the Soviet Union changed a lot, including hiding away a bunch of secrets. The Soviets really liked keeping things quiet. They had the best spy agency and might have even hidden alien contacts. Before the US started doing most of the planet exploring, the Soviet Union was in charge. They had some hits and misses in space, but they were really into Venus, which they called Venera in Russian. That's where the name of their secret Venus project, which lasted from 1961 to 1983, came from. While the US was busy trying to land on the moon, the Soviets went a different way. It's kind of strange how obsessed they were with Venus. Did they want to use it for military stuff? Or maybe try to live there after seeing if anything else was alive? It's hard to know why they cared so much. Because these trips happened during the Cold War, they weren't exactly open about what they were doing. Basically, everything we know about those Venus missions comes from old, secret stuff that's been released. And even then, it's tough to figure out what they were looking for and if they ever found anything. The Soviets didn't just land on Venus a couple of times. They sent 28 rockets over there, which cost a lot. 13 made it into the atmosphere, and 8 actually landed. This made the Soviets big players in space. Of course, the US was trying to keep up, but NASA was more interested in satellites and things like that. They got excited about Mars later. Your history book might not talk about this, but the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into another planet's atmosphere. They were also the first to land softly on another planet and send back pictures and sounds. Yep, the Soviets had their one small step moment before the US did. So why don't we hear about these early missions? Remember how the Soviets liked to keep things secret? That's part of it. In 1992, the Soviet Space Agency shut down when the USSR collapsed. It started up again later as Roscosmos in Russia. But a lot of the old information was lost or destroyed. That's why we don't really know for sure why the Soviets took those pictures. 28 spacecraft went to Venus, but maybe the Soviets just wanted to save money? That's not to say they weren't hoping to find life there. They were looking for water, sunlight, and the right conditions. Without those missions, we wouldn't know how hot Venus is or how thick its atmosphere is. Now, a lot of scientists think Venus can't have life. It's hot enough to melt lead, and there's hardly any water. Plus, the air pressure is way higher than on Earth. But these are recent ideas. We can't just ignore the USSR's work on Venus. They thought it was worth checking out, even if it was just to win the space race. Going to Mars would have been even more expensive. It all comes down to distance. Venus is about 40 million kilometers from Earth, while Mars is around 250 million kilometers away. That big difference in distance means a big difference in cost. And even if the United States had a lot of money, exploring Mars wouldn't have been easy. Some say the Soviet missions weren't reliable and had problems. The spacecraft weren't made for long trips, and they often lost contact with them. So, it makes sense they went for the closer, easier target that would give them results. But we can't forget about the space race. The US wasn't even in the game when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957. That kicked off the competition and kept the Soviets ahead. But why did the US focus on the moon, even though Venus was unexplored and NASA kept failing there in the 60s? NASA had a Venus curse. Every time they tried to send something to Venus, it failed. That's when the Soviet Union jumped at the chance to show them up. Both countries really wanted to win the space race back then. The best way was to do different things. It was like a silent agreement. The Soviet space program basically said, we'll take Earth's sister planet, getting something the US couldn't. Even with money problems and bad government management, the Soviet Union kept sending missions to Venus to stay ahead. NASA focused on the moon, and the American agency tried to make the USSR's Venus thing look silly. Venus got the nickname Hellish planet in the media, while Mars was called our future. But that didn't stop the Soviets. They wanted to beat the Americans, and they did pretty well. The Venera missions are mostly forgotten now. But even though they were a long time ago, they were super complicated and impressive. If you had to pick one thing that started the space age, the Venera program would be a good choice. Back in the 50s, the Soviets started playing around with probe designs. For the next 30 years, they kept building and launching spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Because the Cold War was going on, the Soviets tried to use their money and resources in the best way possible. Luckily, they had bigger, stronger rockets than the US at first. That really helped them. The USSR started building and launching bigger rockets that could go really high and far. They tested spacecraft with and without people on board. Scientists did a lot of math and planning to figure out the right paths for the Venus missions. They were also working on going to Mars too. For the Soviet Space Agency, designing really good tools for these probes was the most important thing. This led to the biggest step forward in space exploration in history. In 1966, the Soviets launched Venera 3, which was the first probe to enter Venus's atmosphere and reach the surface. That made the competition even more intense. Unlike the American missions that kept failing, the Soviet program kept getting better. They kept sending successful probes to Venus. The problem was they didn't have the best designs. The Soviets fixed those problems quickly and launched the best rockets in the Venera program in the 70s. They even did the first double launches, sending Venera 4 and Venera 5 at the same time. A lot of historians think that was the most exciting time in space exploration. The US tried to do similar launches, but why did the Soviets send two to Venus? Well, traveling to other planets needs good tools to get the best information. The first spacecraft was sent to check out the surface, which is what Venera 4 did. After that launch went well and the craft got into Venus's atmosphere, the Soviets sent Venera 5. It wasn't just a repeat of the first one. The second spacecraft was made to get different information about the planet. They were trying to deal with the temperature, air pressure, and radiation on Venus. By the mid-70s, the Soviet program was at its best. Everything they had done until then was about research and making things better, designs, technology, methods, and how everything worked. But for the second part of the Venera missions, the Soviet Union wanted to explore. The best one from that time was Venera 7. It went through Venus's atmosphere and became the first spacecraft to send back data from another planet. By then, they knew how hot Venus was, how thick the atmosphere was, and what the pressure was like. The Soviets even tried to record sounds. Later, in the mid-80s, Venera 13 was even more advanced. It took the first color pictures of Venus's surface. At the same time, the Soviet program launched Venera 14 to get more information about the planet's surface. The Soviet Union was one of the first to explore Venus, and the Russian Space Agency wants to go back. Venera is a mission that NASA and Roscosmos might do together to study Venus's atmosphere and surface. The name Venera comes from a Russian word that means enduring. They plan to launch it in the late 2020s or mid-2030s and will study the planet's air, how it changed, and whether it could have had life. The spacecraft will have a satellite, a lander, and maybe a balloon to study the planet. What to think about all this? The Venera missions were more than just technology and politics. The Soviet Union started them during the Cold War, and they show how smart and determined humans are when it comes to exploring space. Even though they faced problems, the Soviets kept trying to figure out Venus, a planet that seemed like it could never support life. One big part of the Venera missions was using probes to check out the planet's weather and land. These missions made it possible to explore beyond Earth and set the rules for studying planets. The information from the Venera spacecraft gave us a lot of important information about Venus's climate, high temperatures, pressure, and poisonous air. Also, the new technology from the Venera program had a big on space exploration. Making materials that could resist heat, good communication systems, and ways to land safely were important things that helped with missions to Mars and other places. The Venera missions still give us ideas about how to design spacecraft and plan missions today.